In this lecture, we will continue with the mission tour that Paul and Barnabas are taking into the interior of Asia Minor. Up to this point, the various places that they have been, they've always started in the synagogue, and they have not stopped at any cities which did not have a synagogue. As they push into the interior further, however, from Pisidian Antioch toward Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, they are going to find some places where there is no synagogue. And so in these places, they will not be starting with the Jews, they will be starting with outright pagans. So this is the area to which we now turn. So having been basically driven out of Pisidian Antioch, they travel on to Iconium in Acts chapter 14. Now, this is about 90 miles to the east and slightly to the south. Iconium is near the border of Phrygia and Lycaonia, which are provinces in the Roman Empire. The native worship of Lycaonia generally had been directed towards Cybele, which is the fertility deity famous in that part of the world. In their mythology, she had driven her consort to emasculate himself by killing his lover nymph. So I won't go into all of the details of their fertility cult and of the mythology that attends it. But suffice it to say that castration was required for all the priests of Cybele. The religion of Cybele had gained official acceptance within the Roman Empire, and in fact, it had gained that acceptance during the reign of Claudius, about the time that Paul was there. So I don't know whether he came up head on with any of the priests of Cybele, but he very well may have. The city had been honored in AD 41, and it had been given the imperial name Claudiconium. Now, Luke is going to simply call it Iconium. So the actual year that they would be in this area is not for sure. But in any case, this is the area to which they are going, and they're going to travel by Roman road. So after being expelled out of Antioch, Paul and all of the others, as Luke says, Paul and those who were with him, or those of his company, they're going eastward toward the Lycaonian plain, which lies between some small mountain ranges. So traveling over Roman roads and bridges, this is one bridge. This one is not quite as old as Paul. So Paul would not have actually crossed this bridge. This is about 100 years or so later than Paul. But it is the type of thing that we're talking about. So at least it gives you some sense of some of the Roman installations that were along a Roman road. The Romans were incredible engineers for being engineers a couple of millennia ago, and some of the installations that they built then still stand today. So they come to Iconium, and in fact, here will be a synagogue. And as is their custom, Paul and Barnabas are going to attend the synagogue service. The service here would be similar to the service in Pisidian Antioch that we discussed in the last lecture. There would be public readings of scripture, there would be the 18 benedictions, there would be a sermon, a benediction, and so on. Now, Luke does not detail any sermon that Paul gives here. He gave a fairly complete detail of Paul's sermon in Pisidian Antioch. Here he doesn't talk about that, but he certainly indicates that a large number, both of Jews and Gentiles, accepted the Christian message. Now, the Jews, of course, would be from within Judaism. Gentiles we're not sure about. They could be God-fearers, for instance. They could theoretically be outright pagans. We simply don't know. The apostles, on the other hand, are able to perform some miracles so that those were very impressive to those who came to faith, but people were divided about them. And so there were some for them, there were some against them. They created a polarization, apparently, of the population in Iconium. and in all probability, there was polarization within the synagogue itself. In the end, the opposition was enough that their lives were in danger. They could actually have been attacked by those who were opponents. And so they left town and they fled to the neighboring cities of Lystra and Derbe, which are going to be even further to the east. Now, it is in this area of Lystra and Iconium and Derbe that I wanted to mention something that will not be from the New Testament, but it does come from an early work in the late 2nd century. There is a work that was written called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And Thecla is the account of a young woman in Iconium who had listened to Paul's sermons and, in fact, became a convert to Christianity. Later, she would become herself an evangelist or a preacher, and eventually she would give her life for her faith in Jesus Christ. What is interesting about this work, and there's a number of things interesting about it, but at least for our purposes, what is interesting is that this work contains the only ancient physical description of St. Paul. You may have noticed that in the New Testament, there is virtually no physical descriptions of hardly anyone. We don't know what Jesus looked like. We don't know what Peter looked like. We think Peter might have been a big man, but that has more to do with the fact that he was able to haul up on the beach a net full of 153 fish at the end of John's gospel. That does make it sound like he was a big guy. But here we have an actual written description of Paul. And here's what it says. And it's talking about someone by the name of Onesiphorus, he saw Paul coming. A man small in size, we assume that probably refers to his height, bald-headed, bow-legged, well-built, and well-built probably means healthy, with eyebrows meeting. So Paul had the unibrow effect, rather long nose, and full of grace. For sometimes he seemed like a man, and sometimes he had the countenance of an angel. So there you have it. This is the earliest and only really physical description we have of St. Paul in his ministry and in his life as a missionary. So they're going on into the Lycaonian plain, which was the home of the cities of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. These three cities that are in the province of southern Galatia. You can see in this photo that there are some very significant mountains in the background. These would be the mountains of the Taurus Range, which separate the Lycaonian plain from the coastal area of Cilicia, where Paul grew up. So behind this range of mountains lies Paul's home city. Paul did not, in this particular mission outreach, pass through these mountains, but you're going to see that in the second mission outreach, which we will get to a bit later, Paul is going to actually go through a pass in these mountains to reach the same area. There are also a couple of artifacts that I think are interesting. One is in the Archaeological Museum of Konya, which is the biblical side of Iconium. This is actually from the 1st century, so this is from the time of Paul, and it is a Latin inscription that mentions specifically the city name of Lystra. Then on the right, there is a coin from Lystra. This was minted in about 6 BC. It actually has kind of a little pictorial embossment on it that talks about a local legend of the founding of the city. But I think what is interesting to us is that if you look at the bottom, you follow my cursor, you can see in Latin letters the name Lystra. And Latin letters, of course, are what are eventually going to become English letters. At least that's what we use in English. We use the Latin letters of the alphabet. But anyway, this is a coin that probably would have been in circulation in Paul's time. Now, when they arrive at Lystra, they're going to meet an interesting situation because Lystra is bilingual. Like Antioch and Iconium, these cities, Lystra and Derbe, are in southern Galatia, or the province of Galatia. And Lystra being at really the end of the road, at least the Imperial road that comes from Antioch. And because this is a bilingual situation, the language of the area is going to play a significant role in what happens there. So Paul and Barnabas and the rest are going to come into the city, and they are going to encounter a man who has been crippled since he was born. And God is going to heal this man through the ministry of Paul. Now, it is interesting that in a sense, this is a double miracle. Not only is this man healed, but if he is able to walk, that's a miracle too, because if he was crippled from birth, he's never walked before, at least in a normal way. So this was quite a notable miracle, and the people in the city are just deeply impressed by what Paul has done. The bystanders immediately decide that maybe Paul and Barnabas might be gods. It is certainly part of Greco-Roman mythology that at various times gods and or goddesses take the form of humans and appear in certain cities and in certain places. And according to the religious texts of the Greco-Roman religion, people encountered gods as though they were human. So in that sense, the idea that Paul and Barnabas might be gods really is in keeping with the general religious outlook of the Greco-Roman religions. Specifically, they decided that these two leaders must be Hermes and Zeus. So pretty impressive. But the tricky thing is that all of the people shouting about this and all of the hubbub was in the language of the Lycaonians. And that's a language Paul did not know. And apparently none of his party knew this. And in fact, it was not until the priest of Zeus from the temple of Zeus started preparing a sacrifice to honor Paul that it dawned on him what was going on. And of course, at that point, he says, no, I'm not Zeus, and I don't want to sacrifice. And so he barely restrains them. These, incidentally, are the two gods that Paul and Barnabas were mistaken for. Zeus, who is the one on the left, is the leader of the gods who lives on Mount Olympus. And I don't know, but I'm guessing that perhaps Barnabas was thought to be Zeus because probably Barnabas was the older of the two. In any case, Zeus is often depicted as being a rather older, mature man with a full head of hair and a heavy beard. On the other hand, Hermes, who is the messenger of the gods, and he is often depicted with wings. In this case, you'll see wings on his helmet, although it is very common for him to be depicted with wings on his feet or his ankles. But anyway, he is considered the messenger of the gods, and maybe the Lycaonians thought Paul was Hermes because perhaps Paul was the main speaker or the main messenger. In any case, these are the two gods that they mistook Barnabas and Saul for. So Paul now is going to record Paul's sermon to these pagans. In fact, this will be the first sermon that Luke records that seems to be directly to pagans and only to pagans. Previously, as I mentioned a moment ago, all of his encounters so far with Gentiles has been sort of within the wing of the Jewish community. These were God-fearers, or people who were at least friendly toward the synagogue and within cities where there was a synagogue. Here, there is obviously not a synagogue, and these are outright pagans. So Paul seeks to turn his listeners toward the God of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's interesting that he doesn't actually begin with the story of Jesus. He begins with a story of creation, and that God, the one true God, is the creator God, and he is the sustainer of all life. And he has given the gifts of life and crops and rain and sustenance to all of the people that are in the world. Of course, that basic idea that there was only one God is central to Judaism, but it is absolutely bizarre in the framework of Greco-Roman religion, who always believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses. So the idea that there was only one God, this would have been quite a theological barrier to cross. Presumably, if Paul had been successful in convincing them that there was only one God, then he would be able to talk about the story of Jesus, who was the Son of God, and that God had sent into the world, who had died, who had risen from the dead, and so on. Luke doesn't actually talk about that aspect of Paul's message. But since Paul, in all of his other messages, talks about this, we assume that he would have done the same here. Some Jews, however, traveled from Antioch and Iconium, and they arrived at this new preaching point. So they brought with them the animosity that had been held against Paul and Barnabas. And in fact, they were successful in stirring up such a violent opposition to Paul that Paul is going to be dragged from the city, stoned, and left for dead. Now, you remember that this is exactly the reaction that the Sanhedrin had to Stephen earlier in the book of Acts. They drug him out of the city and stoned him and, in fact, killed him. In this particular case, Paul is left for dead, but as it turns out, he does not succumb. Later in his 2 Corinthian letter, he's going to give a list of some of the trials that he suffered as a missionary. And one of them is, in fact, this incident, the stoning at Lystra. For in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul mentions that on one occasion he had been stoned. This, in fact, is that occasion. It's also near that same part of 2 Corinthians that Paul also talks about a very deeply spiritual experience he had, in which he said he was caught up into the third heaven. Some interpreters have wondered whether that was sort of a near-death experience, spiritually speaking, and that the idea of him being caught up into the third heaven was when he nearly died because of being stoned to death. Paul does not directly connect that incident of being caught up into the third heaven with the incident of being stoned. But they are near each other in 2 Corinthians, and it is possible, I suppose, that the one event may have triggered his memory of the other. In any case, Paul is going to survive this, but they don't stay around. He and Barnabas are going to quickly leave Lystra, and they're going to head now to the neighboring town of Derbe. Well, when they preached at Derbe, again, their preaching was successful. Many of the people in Derbe believed their message. And so they are going to retrace their steps now. They're going to visit the new Christians in all of the cities where they have preached, encouraging them in their faith, and especially encouraging them in the face of what is almost certainly going to be persecution. If they have run Paul out of town, if they've nearly killed him, then they're not going to be particularly kind to people in those cities that accepted Paul's message. So he seems to understand that they're going to face some persecution, and he wants to encourage them in that regard. In each of these cities, it also says that they appointed elders. Now, the term elders is the Greek term presbyteroi. The singular would be presbyteros. This is the term that is typically used regarding leaders in the synagogue. So it sounds as though the Christians have borrowed this term from the synagogue, and they are going to apply it to leaders within the Christian church. In fact, this Greek term presbyteros is the term from which we get the modern English word presbyter, and in fact, the name of a particular Christian denomination, which is Presbyterianism, which is basically government by elders or an elders board. One of the, I guess, tricky interpretive issues here is the verb that is used, because the verb that is used is this Greek verb keratoneo. The first part of this verb is really just the word hand. And keratoneo is a verb that means to appoint or to choose by raising the hands. Now, if you were in, say, Athens or somewhere, where the raising of the hands is the way that certain people are selected in a democratic society for leadership. This may mean that the Christians in these cities voted on who would be their leader. On the other hand, sometimes this word keratineo means simply to appoint, and so this is a bit of an ambiguity. Did Paul and Barnabas select the leaders of the church, or did the church itself, sort of under the guidance of Paul and Barnabas, but did the church itself select their own leaders by voting on them? And that issue continues even in different Christian denominations. If you are from a Christian denomination that has more of an episcopal form of government, which would be like the Roman Church or the Eastern Church or the Anglican Church or something like that, they tend to read this verb as appointed, that Paul and Barnabas selected elders and appointed them by their own personal authority. On the other hand, if you happen to come from a Christian denomination that is more congregationally oriented, this would be true of a number of Baptist congregations, congregational congregations, a variety of other evangelical congregations, then you tend to favor the choice by raising the hands. In the end of the day, this Greek verb cannot be pressed to either of those positions because it is ambiguous, and that ambiguity remains in the verb itself. So I guess we'll have to leave that question open. But returning to Antioch, Syria now. Now, keep in mind, there are two Antiochs. There's Antioch and Pisidia, but there's their home mission church in Antioch, Syria. So returning to Antioch, Syria by sea voyage now, which is, of course, their sending church. They're going to go back to their sending church. They're going to report on what has happened. They're going to report on all of the people that have come to faith in Jesus Christ. No doubt they also reported upon those who had been healed or other miracles that had happened, perhaps giving some details about the stoning of Paul in Lystra. All of their mission efforts, they're going to report to their sending church. Now, that brings us then to what is often called the First Ecumenical Council. That term, ecumenical council, particularly since it is used a number of times later in the history of Christianity to refer to the assembly of bishops from all over the world, to call this one the First Ecumenical Council is a little auspicious, maybe a bit of an overstatement. For one thing, there's no evidence that there are any kind of regional bishops in the Christian church at this point. The term bishop or overseer is being used, but it seems to be used in a somewhat less fashion than will eventually become sort of the standard in the 2nd century and beyond. And certainly these are not going to be people from all over the Christian world. In fact, the Christian world at this point is pretty small. The lion's share of Christians are still probably going to be Jewish Christians, and primarily those Jewish Christians that are in the area of Palestine, particularly Judea and Jerusalem. But nonetheless, whether the title First Ecumenical Council is maybe the best title or not, I think we're probably going to be stuck with it. And this is going to be a very, very deeply important moment in the early church, because it has to do with the Gentile question. So when Paul and Barnabas have come back to Antioch and they have reported on their mission work, and of course the Antioch church has sent them to do this, but whether the Antioch church actually envisioned them as going into the interior of Asia Minor and preaching to pagan Gentiles in places where there wasn't even a synagogue, it's hard to say whether that was ever part of the vision of the Antioch church. Perhaps it was. But on the other hand, it sounds like that the trip into the interior was something that was decided en route rather than before they ever left Antioch. So in any case, of course, there are all of these Christians in Lystra, in Derbe, and Iconium, people who were Gentiles who had no background in the synagogue, had no background in the Septuagint. They were right out of raw paganism. And so the question arises, do these Gentiles need to ally themselves with Judaism in order to become Christians? At this point, it's probably fair to say that all of the Christians are, in some sense, within the general wing of Judaism. Even Gentiles who have come to faith in Jesus are still under the wing of the synagogues. So there are going to be those who say, yes, they do need to become Jews in order to become Christians. And then there is Paul and Barnabas who have just done this evangelism, and they're going to say, no, we didn't require that, and we don't think it should be required. Now, you need to understand, of course, that circumcision is a religious symbol of accepting the Jewish faith. To be a member of Judaism, circumcision is required. And in fact, it was the general opinion of Jews within Judaism, and certainly the opinion of the rabbis, that people who were not circumcised did not belong to the people of God. The people of God should be circumcised. This, in fact, was the ritual that was incumbent upon Abraham all the way back in the book of Genesis. He circumcised both his sons Ishmael and Isaac. This is the issue that happens in the early story of Moses, where Moses has a son by the name of Gershom who has not been circumcised. And in fact, the lack of circumcision became an actual threat of death for Moses. Or perhaps Gershom. There's a bit of a textual issue in the Hebrew text there in the book of Exodus, which I don't have time to go into. But in any case, it was a serious issue. The Israelites who were in the desert, they had to be circumcised. And when they got to the Jordan River, where they're going to cross into the land of Canaan, they had to make sure everybody was circumcised, and that became the ritual that was carried on for generation after generation after generation, all the way into the time of Jesus and the first century. So if the uncircumcised were not numbered among God's people, then for those Jews who were insistent upon this, it only made sense to them that these people ought to be circumcised. Well, there's a strong party in Jerusalem that advocates circumcision and Torah observance, and that these are necessary. So they have come to visit Antioch, Syria, and when they have heard what Paul and Barnabas have been doing, they are going to be insistent. Circumcision needs to be required, and Torah observance needs to be required. Well, that puts things in a bit of a different light than at least Paul and Barnabas were thinking. So Paul and his party is going to counter that and say this is not necessary. Barnabas and our party have gone into these places. We have preached the message of Jesus, and they have accepted Jesus as the Messiah and the Lord, and we have not required them to be circumcised. In any case, the issue became tense enough that Barnabas and Paul are going to be sent to Jerusalem to lay this issue before the apostles. Now, I think that is an interesting feature in and of itself, because it does indicate that in the early Christian communities, the apostles were considered to be, I suppose you could say, the last court of appeal. These are those who had followed Jesus, had been his disciples, had been loyal to him all the way since the baptism of John, all the way through the death and the resurrection. These are the ones who were appointed to be Jesus' own personal representatives, which is why they're called apostles. They're the ones that are going to lead the early Christians in the city of Jerusalem. So they're going to appeal to the apostles in Jerusalem for a decision. And when they get to Jerusalem, they encounter some very stiff opposition from Christian Pharisees. It seems apparent from the way Luke words this in the book of Acts that many of the Jews who are Christians in Jerusalem are also Pharisees. So it's not that they suddenly said, well, I've become a follower of Jesus, therefore I put a big X through Phariseeism. No. In fact, what it seems to be is that they were practicing Pharisees and at the same time They had faith that Jesus was the true Messiah and the true Lord of the earth. In fact, because the Pharisees, for instance, as opposed to the Sadducees, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. That basic theology of the Pharisees, in fact, fit Christianity very well, because, of course, the central message was that Jesus was raised from the dead. In any case, when Paul and Barnabas and the rest of them get to Jerusalem, they're going to find this very strong opposition from the Christian Pharisees about whether or not Gentiles need to be circumcised. And so there's going to be a presentation of cases on both sides. The apostles and the elders in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting that they list the elders alongside the apostles, but they are going to listen to the presentation of cases. And in the end, there are going to be two voices who are going to swing the decision toward the side of Paul and Barnabas. The first voice is the big fisherman, Simon Peter. Peter is going to once more rehearse the events that happened in the house of Cornelius, the Roman soldier from Caesarea. When Peter had gone to the home of Caesarea, the home of the Roman soldier in Caesarea, he had just had a vision of non-kosher animals and the divine command out of heaven that says, Peter, slay and eat. Peter says, I've never eaten anything unclean. I don't eat this stuff. But then, of course, the voice has said, do not call anything unclean that I have made clean. And on the basis of that, Peter accompanies these representatives to Caesarea, and he enters the home of this Gentile and begins to tell them the story of Jesus. Now, in the story of Jesus being told, suddenly the Holy Spirit fell upon these Gentiles. And that seemed to be a divine stamp of approval. And it was apparent that they, in fact, did receive the Holy Spirit, because this is the first time since the day of Pentecost that Luke describes anyone speaking in other languages. So Cornelius has not submitted to circumcision. He is a God-fearer, but he has not been circumcised, and yet God has approved of his faith. And as Peter would say on this occasion, he was included in God's people on the basis of grace and faith. Now, that's an interesting statement by Luke in the book of Acts, because it's the sort of statement you would probably expect to find in one of the letters of St. Paul. But this is not a letter of St. Paul. This is Simon Peter, who is speaking to the church in Jerusalem. But he is using those two very sensual words, grace and faith. These people are included on the basis of grace and faith. The witness of Paul and Barnabas, except in this case, I've noted that it is Barnabas and Paul, and I would suggest that as probably because Barnabas is above suspicion in Jerusalem. He has a long history in Jerusalem. Paul does not have this long history, and in fact, Paul was probably still a little bit suspicioned in Jerusalem. We're not sure if that was true by this point, but certainly was earlier. But they recounted their Gentile mission and some of the miracles that happened. I'm sure the argument was that if God performed miracles in their ministry, doesn't that indicate that this is a sign that God approved of what they were doing? So there is this presentation of cases. Finally, the issue is summarized by James, the Lord's brother. Now, keep in mind, this cannot be the James who is the brother of John. That James, the brother of John, was executed back in Acts chapter 11 by Herod Agrippa. However, there is another James, and this is one of the brothers of Jesus who is mentioned in the Gospels. Jesus has 4 brothers, and one of them is James. There's a bit of difference between how different Christians understand these brothers of Jesus. If you are in the Roman Catholic communion, then you understand them actually to be cousins of Jesus. If you're in the Eastern Church, you understand them generally to be children of Joseph before he married Mary, that Joseph was a widower. He had 4 sons by his first wife, and when she died, he married Mary. So these would be older than Jesus. And then the third position is the position that most Protestants take, and that is that these were the half-brothers of Jesus. In other words, they were children of Joseph and Mary, but they were younger than Jesus and born after the birth of Jesus. Well, we won't try to resolve those issues here, except to say that this James is one of these brothers of Jesus, however you're going to understand that. And so he's going to cite the prophet Amos, and he's quoting from the Septuagint, and he's going to quote the prophet Amos, how that the dynasty of David would be rebuilt. Now, in Amos, the dynasty of David is described in a metaphor of the tent of David. David's fallen tent will be rebuilt. The tent is a way of talking about David's dynasty. And so David's dynasty would be rebuilt, and of course that would ultimately issue in the Messiah himself, who is the son of David. So in that passage, Amos also says, however, that in the rebuilding of David's dynasty, the nations would then be the benefactors or the beneficiaries of the good news, and they could be included as part of God's purpose all along. So what James is saying essentially is that the idea of Gentiles being inside the circle of God's people had been part of God's ancient promise from ancient times. So the restoration of David's dynasty has been fulfilled in Jesus, and since Jesus is the son of David and he is the Messiah and the Lord, therefore Gentiles should be welcomed into the circle of Israel. The whole human race was now privileged to seek salvation in him, and in particular, they are able to do that without becoming Jews. They don't have to subscribe to the full range of Jewish practices in order to belong to the people of God. What they do have to do is they have to come to faith in Jesus Christ. So James then advises that they send a letter to these new Gentile congregations. That would be congregations that have Gentiles in them. So some of them had members who were alongside synagogues. Some of them were in places where there were no synagogues. But this letter is going to urge them particularly to show respect to 4 very sensitive Jewish issues. Particularly in those cities where there would be synagogues, there will be Gentiles and Jews living side by side, both believers in Jesus Christ. So the Gentile Christians must be sensitive to Jewish issues. These are Jewish issues that come from the Torah, and because they come from the Torah, then Torah observant Jews are bound to observe them. So these are the 4 issues. First of all, food dedicated to pagan deities. It was very common practice in Greco-Roman cities that food often was dedicated at a pagan temple before it was given to either the general members of society or sold in the agora. The agora would be the open market. You're going to find that, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul is going to address this issue in some detail, particularly in chapters 8 and 10 of 1 Corinthians. He's going to address it from a couple of angles. One is whether or not you can actually buy meat in the open market. Is there a chance this was dedicated to a pagan deity? And if you buy it and eat it, is that going to compromise your faith? And the other would be is if you were invited to someone's home to eat and they serve you meat, how do you know whether this has been dedicated to a pagan deity or not? So Paul is going to address that in his 1 Corinthian letter in a very practical way. Here in this encyclical letter, what they are basically saying is that you need to be sure that you don't eat food that has been dedicated to a pagan deity. That would be highly offensive to your Jewish friends and brothers and sisters in Christ. Secondly, he talks about porneia. The Greek term porneia is a rather broad term that refers to sexual deviation of various kinds. In this particular case, what is likely to be in view is incestuous marriages. Now, since the letter that James composes is about issues that are particularly sensitive to the Torah is very clear that you cannot have incestuous marriages. You can't marry your aunt, you can't marry your sister, you can't marry your mother-in-law, and so on and so forth. I would agree with those scholars who suggest that what is really in view here is incestuous marriages. Now, obviously, porneia is a big category. It includes adultery and fornication and homosexual behavior. All those sorts of things come under the term porneia. But here, I think it's probably referring to the one issue that is especially Torah-oriented, the practice of marrying close relatives, which was fairly common in Roman society. Then there's also the issue of the meat of strangled animals. And the point here, of course, is that if they're strangled, they are not properly bled. And this idea is very closely connected with the idea of eating blood. Blood is a symbol of life itself. And in the Torah, blood is forbidden to be eaten. So these four issues were very sensitive for Jews, especially Jews who were diaspora Jews who lived in Greco-Roman cultures. All of these things happened in Greco-Roman cultures. They did eat food dedicated to pagan gods. They did practice incestuous marriages. They did eat the meat of strangled animals, and they did eat blood. So if you're side by side with your Jewish brother or sister in a Christian congregation, as a Gentile, you need to be sensitive to these kinds of issues. So this letter was drawn up, and it was going to be sent from the Jerusalem church and the apostles to the churches that Paul and Barnabas have started. So let's say a word about sending letters in Imperial Rome. For one thing, there wasn't any general public postal department in the Roman Empire. We're so accustomed to just putting a stamp on a letter and sticking it in the box. But that didn't happen in the Greco-Roman world. There was a postal service, but it was largely available to government officials, and private parties couldn't tap into that. So the only way that you could send a letter in the Greco-Roman world was to have a private courier. So sending a letter was a big deal. It wasn't a matter of putting a stamp on a piece of paper. It was a matter of getting a private courier, paying for their passage on some kind of a commercial sea vessel or by land or however they're going to get it there, and carrying it personally so that it could be delivered by hand to those to whom it was sent. So the letter from the Jerusalem church is composed, and it is ordered to be carried by Paul and Barnabas. This means that Paul and Barnabas will go back to the churches they have already established so that they can read this letter to the churches. And along with Paul and Barnabas, the Jerusalem church is going to send a couple of other brothers, one by the name of Judas and one by the name of Silvanus, or we sometimes know him a little better as Silas. They would validate the letter by their own personal testimony. Now, whether this Judas, maybe I should say which Judas this is, we're not sure. There's several Judases in the New Testament, one of which was, in fact, a half-brother of Jesus also, but others as well. So we're not sure who this Judas was, but Silas, of course, is going to become important later because he will eventually become a missionary companion to Paul. So the four of them were sent, first of all, to Antioch. This was the church where, of course, the big tension originally occurred. And there they would deliver this letter to the church in Antioch and resolve the problem. Now, that brings us to the beginning of the second great tour. Of course, the second great tour is going to begin with Paul and Barnabas taking this letter from the Jerusalem church to all of the places that they have previously established small congregations of believers in Jesus. As they're getting ready to go, an issue comes up between Paul and Barnabas. You remember that in the first tour, John Mark had gone with Paul and Barnabas. He got as far as the coastline of Asia Minor, and then he, for whatever reason, had second thoughts and returned to Jerusalem. We can only speculate why he left the team at that point and went back to Jerusalem. But whatever the reason was, it seemed to have set badly with Paul. And now as they are going to begin this second mission tour, Paul and along with Barnabas, and Barnabas is going to want to include John Mark again. Of course, John Mark is a relative of Barnabas, so that makes some sense as well. Paul, on the other hand, says, I won't have him. And they're going to disagree about the usefulness of John Mark. So the disagreement was strong enough that Barnabas is going to take John Mark and he will go to Cyprus. Now, presumably, there were some believers in Cyprus. We know there was at least a few. Barnabas, of course, is from Cyprus himself, and we would assume that he would take a copy of the letter from Jerusalem to Cyprus. Paul, on the other hand, is going to take one of the other two the Jerusalem church has sent, and that is Silas. And he's going to take him and travel through the congregations in Syria and Cilicia. This time, rather than going by sea voyage, he's going to travel overland. And he's going to pass through what is called the Cilician Gates, over the Taurus Mountains, in order to visit the churches in the southern province of Galatia. So this is going to be back to the same churches, but by a rather different route. Silas, of course, is going to turn out to be quite an admirable choice for Paul, because Silas, as well as Paul, is a Roman citizen. That's going to figure significantly in a couple of the places that they eventually go, that they are both Roman citizens. And of course, Silas is one of the guarantors of the authenticity of the Jerusalem Council's letter. So Paul and Barnabas are going to split at this point. Barnabas takes Mark, goes to Cyprus. Paul takes Silas and heads northward overland to the churches in southern Galatia. In the upper left, you can see part of the Roman road that actually goes out of Tarsus in Cilicia and heads northward. As I mentioned earlier, the Romans were great engineers, and there are a number of places where Roman roads are still intact 2,000 years later. In fact, some of them are still in use 2,000 years later, and this is one of them. Then the picture on the right shows the pass through the Taurus Mountains. Today, of course, as you can see, the pass has a modern highway that threads its way between the mountains and up through the valleys and eventually crosses the Taurus Range. This is, of course, where Paul and Silas would have gone on foot. Now, Paul and Silas going through the Cilician Gates on foot is probably a lot more hazardous than driving in a modern automobile. It's a long ways, for one thing, and there are many dangers. In fact, in his 2 Corinthian letter, Paul is going to talk about all the kinds of dangers that he experienced in his missionary travels. Dangers from rivers, dangers from bandits, often hungry, often without enough to drink. So he's going to talk about some of those kinds of things. And so Paul and Silas are headed off to get to, eventually, the southern province of Galatia. This is their route. They left Jerusalem, and you follow my cursor. They left Jerusalem and the council, where the letter was originally composed by James and the leaders in Jerusalem. They went back up to the church at Antioch, where the letter was read to the churches. From Antioch, Barnabas and Mark are going to go to Cyprus. Paul and Silas are going to go around this little bay through Tarsus and Cilicia and eventually up to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium in southern Galatia, and eventually all the way to the Aegean Sea and beyond. So this is the route that they're going to do, and this is going to be mostly by foot. All the way from Jerusalem to Troas is going to be by foot. Then at various points, they're going to have a mixture, some by foot, some quite a bit by sea. Also, it's probably worth pointing out that eventually Paul is going to establish churches in Macedonia up in this area, as well as Greece in this area. And he is going to write letters to some of these churches. He will eventually write a letter to the Philippians. He will write 2 letters to the Thessalonians, and he will write at least 2 letters to the Corinthians, probably more than 2. We know he wrote 1, which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians that we don't have a copy of. And many scholars think 2 Corinthians may be actually 2 letters that were brought together. But be that as it may, there are at least 3 churches that Paul eventually is going to write letters to that would be established on this second missionary journey. Let's take a brief look at the kind of travel conditions and distances that Paul and Silas are going to encounter in this second missions tour. So they start in Jerusalem. Eventually, they will end all the way up in Antioch. Again, they're sending church. But look at the distances we're talking about. Jerusalem and Antioch, 375 miles by foot. Antioch to Cilicia, another 140 miles. Almost 500 miles to southern Galatia. Another 500 miles to the seacoast of the Aegean. Then they cross about 140 miles by sea to Neapolis near Philippi. Some shorter distances here between some of these cities, but then there's another 300 miles or so between Berea and Athens. And then eventually from Corinth to Ephesus is another 250 miles. And then they will have 620 miles by sea, mostly by sea, partly by land, all the way back to Antioch. So if you look down here, you see a lot of these are by land, a few are by sea, but the distances are considerable. So if you're going to travel with St. Paul as a missionary, you better be prepared to walk. It might be a good idea to carry an extra set of sandals. Quite a rigorous tour. So they're going to revisit Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium. In fact, in Lystra, Paul is going to encounter a young man by the name of Timothy, who is going to be his understudy, I suppose you could say. He is a convert, a very eager student of the Hebrew Scriptures, which he began learning when he was simply a child from his mother and his grandmother. Paul invites Timothy to join the team, and here's an interesting point. He does require Timothy to be circumcised because his mother is Jewish. Now, Paul will have another colleague by the name of Titus, who is not Jewish at all. Titus does not, in fact, Paul does not, in fact, require Titus to be circumcised. But he is going to require it of Timothy because his mother is Jewish. So, in a sense, this sort of exemplifies what Paul says. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. To those who are not under the law, as those that are not under the law. Even though he's treating these two people differently, he's doing it in a consistent way with his understanding of what should be or should not be Torah observant. In any case, Timothy is duly ordained for Christian service. In fact, in one of the Timothy letters, it mentions that this was done by the laying on of hands, the imposition of hands. And so now they're going to travel through the congregations established earlier, and Paul is going to deliver to them the encyclical letter that was composed by the Jerusalem church. So this would be a great encouragement to them that in order to be a Christian, they didn't necessarily have to become a Jew. And so Paul reads the letter to the churches, and I'm sure that they were all encouraged by that.